Hello and welcome to Dialogue. On August the 1st, the deadline for the U.S. Congress to raise its debt limit will arrive. If no action is taken between now and then, the U.S. government could, in theory, default on its loans, which could send economic and financial shockwaves throughout the world. So where is this bargaining between Republicans and Democrats headed in the Congress? Will we see a repeat of the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, where the two sides played game of chicken? And what are the economic ramifications for the U.S., China, and the rest of the world? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, also by Anthony Chen, the former J.P. Morgan Chase chief economist, and later on by Wang Dan, the chief economist of Hang Seng Bank China. That's our topic. I'm Wang Guan. Well, Professor Zhang Gong, let me go to you. Can you explain to our viewers briefly what is this debt ceiling all about, and what if the debt ceiling is hit?
Well, according to the U.S. Constitution, it is the Congress that has the right to raise debt and issue debt to the public. So in order for the administration to issue debt, it has to acquire Congress approval. But you can't do this every year. So I think in the middle of the First World War, that was in 1970, the Congress passed a piece of legislation that says that the Congress will set a limit, and the Treasury Department can operate under that limit. What's also called a statutory debt limit, or debt ceiling is often called. So this is an issue that came up, almost like once every few years, that the Treasury is forced to raise the debt ceiling, and that goes to Congress for approval. So the GOP has been using this as essentially a bargaining tool to reduce, to control the federal spending, to reduce the deficit. So this become a political ritual, once every few years that both parties will fight over. It has been several such cases that both parties in Congress have been fighting for raising the limit, and each time it has come to the point that the consensus was reached at the last minute. The U.S. government will not be default on its debt quite anytime soon. Janet Yellen, Secretary of Treasury, wrote a letter to Nancy Pelosi that it is going to enter into a phase of using what's called extraordinary measures to pay for the bills, I guess, for the U.S. government. But I guess there's some reports saying that sometime into August, the Treasury Department will run out of these extraordinary measures, and by that time, the government will have to be defaulting on its debt, and that's a serious matter in my view. So I think between now and sometime probably in late August, Congress has to come to a resolution to raise the limit. Okay. So that's the situation right now we're in.
Okay, hopefully there will be a solution of some sort. Dr. Wang Dan, let me go to you. The United States is one of the few countries in the world with a debt ceiling. Other countries, most countries, can function relatively effectively without such a debt ceiling. Why can't the United States? I mean, how do you look at this round of debt ceiling challenge?
The reason why that U.S. wanted to set a debt ceiling is because they want to put a quota, a cap, on how much the federal government can borrow, because that's the fiscal responsible thing to do. But since 2008, we have seen that the U.S. government debt has increased by more than 500%, while at the same time, the national income only increased by 30%. So over and over time again, we see that the federal government and two parties are arguing over how much more they can raise the debt. So by the fundamentals of the U.S. government, it actually still looks healthy. I don't think there is any immediate threat to the soundness of the debt payment capacity. And also comparing to other rich economies like Japan or Italy, the US government has a much higher prospect of growth. So I don't doubt its debt repayment ability. But the risk now is that the legislators may miscalculate when the last moment will come. You can't just raise that ceilings again and again and forever. So at some point, maybe the debt default will happen. And by then, nobody is really prepared.
Right. Let's talk about the politics, the political side of this. Anthony, you know, what is the atmosphere, the mood there like in Washington? I mean, what could be the grand bargaining between the Republicans and Democrats in the Congress?
Well, what we're seeing here is sort of a kabuki dance, because I think everybody knows in Washington that we cannot allow any sort of default. They will continue to use these extraordinary measures, as Professor Gong has correctly indicated. And in fact, some people in Washington say that they can continue that extraordinary measures strategy well into October, if need be, if they really push extra hard. Right now, the Republicans are saying that they will not vote for increases in the debt ceiling because they don't want President Biden to push or pass the $3.5 trillion infrastructure package, or the so-called human infrastructure package. But I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding, because when you allow the government to borrow money to pay for debts in the past, that's something that should be taken as granted, because many of those programs were proposed and enacted by both Democrats and Republicans. So in order to stop future more program spending, you're going to prevent the government from paying its debt that it has incurred in the past is quite silly to me. And so that's why the debt ceiling has become a sort of a political football. But the Republicans know that with budget reconciliation, the Democrats can, in fact, push through an increase in the debt ceiling. And if they do that, then all the problems go away. The Democrats obviously don't want to do that, because then they will be credited with passing increases in that ceiling, and they will be viewed as being irresponsible. But at the end of the day, if it comes down to a potential default, I think both parties will have to blink, or at least one party will have to blink, and I think we'll be fine. But over the near term, there's always this level of anxiety in the financial markets until this gets done.
Right. Talking about, you know, this game of chicken, at least that's the feeling of many. Professor John Gong, how do you look at this? Because if you look at the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, the Republicans apparently took a hit politically because many blamed the Republicans for this game of chicken, brinkmanship that they're playing with the Obama administration and the Democrats over there. What do you foresee to happen this year?
I think it's probably going to see the same scenario. We're going to see the same scenario. Well, I mean, the 2011 scenario you described, event in the Obama administration, was even worse than that. It was really a political standoff, in my view. And I hope this time, the battle in Congress will not go that far. But this is the situation that just came up. I mean, the Republicans are using this as a political show, as a bargaining chip, basically, and I think indeed the issue is really about this infrastructure bill. But I have to say that the debt ceiling, the speed at which this debt ceiling has to be raised is really extraordinary in the last 4 years during the Trump administration. I mean, he was dealing with a debt ceiling of somewhere around like $20 trillion. Now we have gone to 28, if I'm correct, at $28 trillion. That's an increase about 20%, just less than within less than 4 years. So, at this speed of that increase, I think it is a serious issue here. The United States debt level as a percentage of GDP used to be well less than 100%. Right now, it's well over 100%. I think it's like 120-some percent, close to 130%. It's still sort of in the middle range among the list of countries, in terms of national debt as percentage of GDP. But it's a very significant increase of the debt level. So I think the GOP does have a point that the debt level has to be controlled, and it just cannot go on like this. But I think by resorting to this kind of a strategy, by pushing the U.S. government to the brink of default, that's probably going a little bit too far.
Well, Dr. Wang Dan, looking at all this from the point of view of an economist, how do you look at this? I mean, who does the U.S. government owe its money to, and how do you look at the fiscal soundness of the U.S. government? Should there be a debt ceiling increase this time?
I believe there has to be a debt ceiling increase this time because the situation is quite severe. If you look at the latest Gallup survey of American people, there's this question, are you thriving? And we will see the answer to this question is surprisingly optimistic. About 60% of the United States people said they're more optimistic than before. And that's quite unusual given that the economy is still technically in a recession. So when we look at what will happen if the debt default happens, there will be a quite disastrous consequence to the stock market. We will definitely see a stock market tumble. And then the bond yield will go down because people will suddenly rush to safe assets like gold and bond. And larger amount of money rush into the bond market that will push up the bond prices and drive down the bond yield. And given that, the dollar will weaken. And there will be a lot of uncertain consequences, especially to the low-income people and also to the emerging markets. So I think the global financial crisis, the global financial system is counting on the U.S. debt as a risk-free asset. So it basically means it cannot default.
I mean, Anthony, how do you look at this economic and financial ramifications, many of which have been already specified by Dr. Wang Dan over there? What would be the severe challenges if there were to be no debt ceiling increase?
Well, clearly we know that if there is no debt ceiling increase, the U.S. would default. But I think both political parties know that that would be a disaster. So I have no doubt that the debt ceiling will be increased. The question is whether the Democrats will be blamed for increasing the national debt level, a ceiling, or whether it's the Republicans or whether they do it in a bipartisan fashion. That is the issue that we have. But in terms of increasing that national debt, both parties have done it. In fact, during the Trump administration, we had an $8 trillion increase in the national debt during his administration. And yes, it will have implications. The last time in 2011, just because it appeared as though we were not going to increase it, even though I think most economists knew that it would happen eventually. But because financial markets thought there was a threat, we saw that our debt rating was brought down a notch by the rating agencies. So that is exactly what would happen again. And I think that we learned from 2011. I don't think we'll allow that to happen. And it will be a serious issue for financial markets because even if there is a small perceived threat that there's going to be any delay in payments, that is enough to make investors all over the world nervous, especially because they're holding a lot of these bonds.
So, Dr. Wang Dan, do you also worry about a potential downgrade or negative impact to America's credit rating?
Oh, absolutely. Because the America's debt ceiling is somewhat associated strongly with its credit rating. And when the credit rating for the U.S. is going down, and that means its bond, its stock market, its other assets will also go down in value. And it will have a ripple through effect throughout the world. And we have seen that there are many creditors to the U.S. already start to worry. And people wonder if this dollar-denominated and dollar-dominated system can last as strongly as before. Given how the economy has performed so far, people have reasons to be optimistic, but still the stock price is at all-time high. And then there is a strong influence from the emerging markets performance as well. If the U.S. government debt really default, that means there will be a capital flight away from the emerging markets. It will be very difficult for countries like Argentina and Turkey to borrow from the international market. And since those economies are heavily in foreign debt, they will be in big trouble if the U.S. is downgraded and all those following consequences happened.
Right. In Washington, Professor Zhang Gong, the Republicans have always been saying that there should be no such thing as unchecked government spending. But if you look at the record during the Trump administration, nearly $5 trillion additional dollars have been spent under his watch. A lot of them on defense and military spending over there. What kind of reform do you think the Republicans are looking for this time?
I think first of all, you talk about the Democrats' position. The Democrats think that the big issue is really because a big budget deficit is really because of Trump's tax reduction legislation that was passed, and that really explaining the revenue shortfall. And on top of this, we have the COVID situation, which the United States government spent like $3 trillion more than it collects. So it was a disastrous situation. Back to your question, about the U.S. Government expenditures. I totally agree that the U.S. government spends way too much, for example, on defense. It is probably the country that has the highest percentage of government budget spent on defense and other related expenditures. And I think that has to change. And also, I think Republicans' position is that on the welfare side, on these expenditures, what's described as soft infrastructure, there's a lot of spending items out there. They're still negotiating. I think probably the consensus about reaching a infrastructure bill is not to come anytime soon. It's probably going to be dragging on for a while. I think if you ask me to assign the blame, I would assign the blame on both sides of the aisle. Both sides are responsible for the current situation, and I guess they have to. It's very difficult, I think, to introduce some kind of a structural solution to the long-term problem of U.S. government's debt issue. It's a very large problem. It's $20 trillion, $28 trillion of a hole. And if you calculate this on a per capita basis, there's a lot of money on each American citizen to bear that burden.
For sure. Also, the debt is increasing as well. So, Anthony, if you look at where the United States government is spending its money and how the money has been spent over the years and decades, how do you look at the fiscal health of the U.S. government? Where are the things that perhaps government officials and policymakers can improve upon?
Well, I think that there is always a ways to improve, but I think that if you look at what has happened historically, there's been a lot more spending than the revenues that have been coming in. There is a great need for infrastructure in the United States, so I think that is a prudent way of spending the money. It's an investment in the future that will boost productivity, will boost economic growth. The U.S. economy did take a big hit. We had a recession for 2 months since COVID hit, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. We're glad that it's over, but still the economy is still suffering. We still have almost 7 million people that are not working that were working before COVID. So I agree that the economy still is weak. We did get 6.5% growth in the second quarter, but with so many people unemployed, we certainly need to continue to monitor the overall economy. And in terms of spending, I think we just have to be a lot more careful in the way we spend, whether it comes to defense, whether it becomes expenditures, entitlements. But on infrastructure, I would have to believe that it is important because infrastructure spending leads to increases in productivity and increases in growth. And that is something that we cannot skimp on. The other things we could probably trim to some extent, but that is something that I think is front and center and should not be abandoned, irrespective of which political party is arguing for or against. And infrastructure should be something that should be a bipartisan effort for the United States.
Dr. Wang Dan, how do you look at this? What are the areas that you think the government of the United States can trim or cut its spending, and what are the things that they should maybe increase or boost their spending on?
The US government has spent quite heavily in subsidizing its consumers. At some point, I guess this type of stimulus has to tone down because right now, if we look at the US consumption, it's about 20% higher than the pre-COVID level. And in contrast, China now only has 8% of increase in its consumption compared to the pre-COVID level. So the too generous subsidies to consumers might make the economy overheat, and that's a big burden fiscally. And also, I think the US already started to cut down its military spending, but still, Trump administration didn't start a war within 4 years, and that means the inventory in its weapon producers in the US are kind of stocking up. So we might want to look out for the uncertainties in terms of some military action in the unrested areas, especially in the Middle East. And above that, I do think there is a high need to spend more in social welfare, especially when it comes to poverty reduction by the US standard, and then subsidizing the low-income group in terms of their career development and, in general, the job market subsidies.
Right. You know, I get asked this question a lot by our Chinese viewers, so I've got to pick your mind on this too, ladies and gentlemen. So that is, Dr. Gong, let me go to you first. People are asking this. China owns about 1.1 trillion, or about 4% of the 28 trillion US national debt. How will China be affected if the US cannot pay? What measures can China take to protect itself from a US default?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think it's a very low probability event. I don't think that the Congress will go that far to let the U.S. government default on that. But in the event of default, of course, that China is going to take a hitting. The U.S. dollar will be devaluated. The government's public bond rating will be decreased, and certainly, that $1 trillion, that's actually 1.1 trillion, as I understand it, would be a great risk. But I think, the people who are managing this huge amount of money, they're really professionals. I think, for example, Bank of China's New York office, they have great analysts, taking care of our Chinese government's treasure there. So I think that's just a very small probability event. And even if we're near that scenario, I think the government in China will, at least the Bank of China people will take precautionary measures to make sure that our investment in U.S. Treasury bonds and bills will be safe.
Dr. Wang Dan, what do you think?
I agree with Professor Gong. China has $3 trillion in foreign reserve, and a bulk part of that is in terms of the U.S. Treasury bond. And in the past, there were efforts that Chinese government wanted to diversify those dollar-denominated assets into other currency-denominated assets. But then it turned out when financial crisis happened globally, it is very hard to liquidate those other assets. So now China is kind of stuck with this really big pile of dollars. And to prevent things like this to happen in the future, I do think that China is and will continue to look for new ways to invest its foreign reserve and also trying to decrease that. Because right now, with the pressure of depreciation of the US dollar, Chinese yuan is under huge pressure of appreciation. We have seen accumulation of the dollar in China's central bank's balance sheet and its financial system. So this has to go through a systematic change in the coming years. And also on top of that, China needs to gradually open up its capital account and stabilize its macroeconomy. And this will be the key.
Yeah. Anthony, how do you look at this Chinese concern?
Well, I think the Chinese have already taken steps. If you look at the path of the Treasury debt ownership, it has stabilized. It basically has stabilized at $1.1 trillion. They used to be one of the largest holder of these bonds, and of course now Japan has moved ahead. China's number 2, Japan holding $1.2 trillion. I agree with everyone so far, categorizing the probability of a U.S. default as being very, very low. I would agree wholeheartedly with that view. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think China has already taken the correct and prudent steps not to increase their national debt. But the reality is that I see it as very low probability, because it's not just China and not just Japan. There's a whole list of countries out there. The United Kingdom, they're holding about $443 billion. Luxembourg is up there. Ireland is certainly in the top 5. So there are many countries that are going to be impacted by this. And I think the United States understands that it would be a global disaster if they were to default on debt. So I think you will continue to see this game of chicken, as you described it. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the U.S. will honor its debt, and all these countries really have nothing to worry about.
So, Professor Zhang Gong, we have 5 minutes left. On the larger question, that is, what is a healthy or good level of deficit spending? Because some level of deficit spending, as many economists would point out, can be good, but also if you accumulate a lot of debt, the next generation will have to pay a whole lot of interest on that. That is not rocket science. So do you think the U.S. has the right balance right now?
Yeah, this is an interesting, very intriguing philosophical question. I remember one of the founding fathers of the United States, I can't remember the exact name, he had a very famous saying that national debt, a little bit of a national debt is a national blessing. Well, in the very beginning, there is the national debt. I mean, the very foundation of the United States was actually established based on borrowing some money during the Independence War. And over the years, if you look at the history, this national debt is being steadily building up. And I think one of the important lessons here is that every time during a major war in U.S. history, the national debt level just got a huge boost. It happened in the First World War, in the Second World War, in the Vietnam War, and of course, the biggest buildup, in my view, is during Reagan days that we have this Cold War. So I think one of the big lessons here is indeed that the national debt level has a lot to do with the defense expenditures, and I think this is something that U.S. politicians don't want to talk about. And I think that we really need to do some soul searching and face this very important lesson here, that they need to tone down its expenditures on national defense. And this industry has become so big, the national defense industrial complex has become so large that it's out of control, in my view.
Dwight Eisenhower first warned America about the military-industrial complex 70 years ago. Much of the warning, it looks like, remains true or relevant today. Dr. Wang Dan, how do you look at this? How much debt is too much?
I think to answer this question, we have to think about an alternative world where the U.S. doesn't have a debt ceiling, and how much should it spend? And in my mind, actually, the U.S. spending so far has been mostly fiscally responsible, because after the 2008 global financial crisis, many people criticized the Obama government for not spending enough. So the recession dragged on and on. And this time, a lot of Keynesian-style economists really acclaimed for the government's seemingly overly generous fiscal spending. And that seemed to have very positive results. And I am quite surprised to see that there seems to be a different consensus now within economists, especially when you hear the prominent macroeconomist Olivier Blanchard talking about such level of debt can be sustainable, given that the economic growth can be a lot faster than the debt service fee. So now is the time to test if his hypothesis is right, and I wholeheartedly believe that there is a chance that he might be.
All right, Dr. Wang Dan, thank you for your insight. I also want to thank Anthony Chen and Professor Zhang Gong from University of International Business and Economics. Thank you also very much for being part of tonight's dialogue. And also, I want to thank our viewers for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.